The president told New York to drop dead. The city had 48 hours left, October 30th, 1975. New York City, early morning. Newspaper delivery trucks are making their rounds through the 5 boroughs. Stacks of papers are being dropped at newsstands and corner stores. Copies are being slid under apartment doors and left in lobbies. On the front page of the New York Daily News, in the largest type the paper has used in years, is a headline that will be remembered for the rest of the century. Ford to city, drop dead. Within hours, the entire city knows. Within days, the entire country knows. Within weeks, it has become the most famous newspaper headline in American history. And here is the first thing you need to understand about that headline. President Gerald Ford never said those words. Not those words, not anything close to those words. He gave a speech. He refused to help. The headline writer at the New York Daily News captured the meaning of that refusal in 4 words that Ford himself later said cost him the 1976 presidential election. But Ford never told New York City to drop dead. He did not have to. The city was already in the process of doing exactly that. $6 billion in debt, banks refusing to lend anymore. Payroll for the police department, the fire department, the teachers, the sanitation workers, the hospital staff, all of it sitting hours away from not being met. New York City, in October 1975, was not a city approaching a financial crisis. It was a city that had already collapsed. That was simply waiting for the rest of the world to notice. This is the story of the year New York City ran out of money, the president who refused to help, the headline that changed everything, and why every dark thing that happened to this city in the decade that followed traces directly back to what was decided in 1975. To understand how the greatest city in the world ran out of money, you need to understand the decade that came before. Here's the simple version. Starting in the mid-1960s, New York City began spending significantly more than it was taking in through taxes and other revenue. The reasons were real and complicated. The middle class was leaving for the suburbs, the tax base was shrinking, the population requiring city services, including the poorest and most vulnerable residents, was growing. And so, the city borrowed. Year after year, it issued bonds, essentially promising investors that future revenue would repay current debts to cover the gap between what it was spending and what it was collecting. This is not unusual. Cities and governments borrow money all the time. The problem is that New York was not using that borrowed money to build things that would generate future revenue. It was using it to pay for everyday operating expenses, salaries, services, the day-to-day costs of running a city of 8 million people. You cannot do that indefinitely. And for a decade, nobody with the authority to stop it was willing to be the one to stop it. Mayor after mayor chose to keep the services running, keep the workers paid, keep borrowing to cover the difference. The alternative was telling 8 million people that services they depended on were going to be cut, that workers were going to be laid off, that the city they lived in could no longer afford to be what it had been. Nobody wanted to deliver that message, so they borrowed and borrowed and borrowed again until the banks said no. The crisis arrived in early 1975. The city needed to roll over its short-term debt. This means that bonds that were coming due needed to be paid off by issuing new bonds. Investors buy the new bonds, the old bonds get paid, and the cycle continues. In the spring of 1975, investors stopped buying. Not because of any single dramatic event, because enough people in the financial community had looked carefully at the numbers and reached the same conclusion. The city of New York could not continue borrowing at this rate indefinitely. The risk of default was real, and nobody wanted to hold the bonds when that default happened. Without new buyers for its bonds, New York City could not pay off its old bonds coming due. And without paying off the old bonds, it could not make payroll. The crisis was not a possibility anymore. It was happening. Mayor Abraham Beame, who had taken office only in January 1974 and had inherited a financial situation he was already describing as a disaster, arrived, was now presiding over what looked increasingly like the imminent bankruptcy of the 3rd largest city on Earth. Here is what it actually meant when the city could not make payroll. Here's the simple version. Think about every person and every service that makes New York City function. Police officers responding to crime in neighborhoods where crime was already at historic highs. Firefighters responding to the arson epidemic that was consuming the South Bronx. Teachers in public schools serving hundreds of thousands of children. Sanitation workers collecting the garbage of 8 million people. Hospital workers keeping the city's public hospitals open. All of them were now in the position of not knowing, week by week, whether their paychecks would arrive. The city responded by cutting. Deeply, 60,000 city workers lost their jobs. 60,000. In a single year. The fire department closed firehouses. In the South Bronx, where buildings were already burning at a rate that had no precedent in peacetime American history, the city closed firehouses. The firefighters who remained in the borough described responding to calls with resources so stretched that they could barely contain what they were already fighting, let alone reach everything that needed them. The police department lost officers at exactly the moment crime in New York was climbing toward the levels that would define the city's darkest decade. The City University of New York, which had been free to attend since its founding in 1847, began charging tuition. For the first time in over a century, a free college education in New York City was no longer free. Subway fares went up, bus lines were cut, library hours were reduced. The social infrastructure that 8 million people depended on was being dismantled piece by piece. Not because anyone believed the city would be better without it, but because there was no money left to keep it running. While the city was cutting, Mayor Beam and Governor Hugh Carey were doing something that no major American city had ever had to do in the modern era. They were going to Washington to beg. Through the spring and summer of 1975, New York's representatives made trip after trip to the nation's capital, meeting with members of Congress, with Treasury Department officials, with anyone who would listen, trying to secure the federal loan guarantees that would allow the city to get back into the credit markets and avoid outright default. What they found in Washington was something that surprised them. Almost nobody wanted to help. This was not simply a matter of Republicans refusing to bail out a Democratic city, though that dynamic was real. Even Democrats were hesitant. House Majority Leader Tip O'Neill privately doubted whether a bailout could pass even in a Congress dominated by his own party. A young senator from Delaware named Joe Biden was recorded at congressional hearings questioning why the taxpayers of his state should have to rescue New York City. President Ford's advisors, a group that included Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, were firmly opposed. Alan Greenspan, then chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, wrote internal memos arguing that New York's default would not have significant national consequences. There was a sense in Washington that New York City had created its own problems through decades of reckless spending, and that bailing it out would simply reward that recklessness and encourage other cities to follow the same path. Ford agreed. On October 29, 1975, he gave a speech at the National Press Club in Washington. He said he would veto any bill that provided a federal bailout to New York City. He said that if the country kept spending more than it had, providing more benefits and more services than it could pay for, then a day of reckoning would come to Washington, just as it had come to New York. And when that day came, who would bail out the United States of America? The next morning, the Daily News ran the headline, "Ford to City, Drop Dead." Ford had not said those words. What he had said was worse. He had said the city deserved what was happening to it. The headline changed the political situation almost immediately. The backlash was enormous. Mail and phone calls poured into the White House. The image of the President of the United States abandoning the country's largest city, in those 4 words, was something that could not be easily managed or explained away. Ford later said in his memoirs that the Daily News headline was the single most damaging political event of his presidency, that it cost him New York State in the 1976 election, and that losing New York State cost him the election itself. A headline about something he never actually said may have determined the outcome of a presidential election. Within weeks of the speech, as the reality of what default would actually mean became clearer, Ford reversed course. In December 1975, he signed legislation providing $2.3 billion in seasonal federal loans to New York City. But the loans came with conditions, severe conditions. Here is what being saved actually cost New York City. Felix Rohatyn, an investment banker who had been recruited by the state to help manage the crisis, spent months constructing what was called the Grand Bargain, the framework that allowed the city to survive without declaring outright bankruptcy. The city unions agreed to invest their pension funds in city bonds, a massive bet that the city would survive to repay them. That bet was not obviously wise at the time. The banks agreed to restructure the city's debt rather than demanding immediate repayment, accepting worse terms than they were legally owed, and the city agreed to the austerity measures that Washington demanded: more layoffs, more service cuts, an emergency financial control board that stripped the elected city government of significant fiscal authority and handed it to a board that was not answerable to voters. New York City, the greatest city in the world, the city that had built the subway and the Brooklyn Bridge and the Empire State Building, was now being run, in its most essential financial decisions, not by the people its citizens had elected, but by a board imposed upon it as a condition of survival. The city accepted these terms because the alternative was worse. Now here is the connection that this channel has been building towards since its first video. Every story of the city falling apart that this channel has told traces back to what happened in 1975. The subway that became the most dangerous place in America. The city had just laid off transit police officers. The South Bronx that burned for profit through an entire decade. The fire stations that could have responded were being closed to save money. The 1977 blackout that led to 1,600 stores being looted in 25 hours. The police force had been gutted. There were not enough officers to respond to a citywide emergency. The crack epidemic that would arrive in 1985 and kill thousands. The social services that might have intercepted it, the community resources, the prevention programs, had been stripped away in the austerity years. The 2,245 murders in 1990, the direct downstream consequence of a police department that had been systematically reduced at exactly the moment it needed to grow. Every dark era this channel has covered was not an accident. It was not simply the inevitable result of changing times. It was what happened when a city ran out of money in 1975 and the people in power chose to meet that crisis by cutting the services that protected the people with the least power to protect themselves. The firehouses, the police precincts, the school counselors, the community centers, the hospital wards, all of it cut, all of it gone, all of it left as a wound that the city carried into the decade that followed. New York City today is not the city of 1975. It recovered. The financial structures put in place during the crisis stabilized eventually. The credit markets reopened. The economy that had been fleeing the city through the 1970s began to return in the 1980s and accelerated through the 1990s. Today, New York City has a budget that functions, credit ratings that are healthy, services that, while never perfect, exist at a level the city of 1975 could not have imagined. The Emergency Financial Control Board still technically exists. It was placed in dormancy in 1986 when the city's finances were declared stable. It has never been formally dissolved. The building where the New York Daily News printed the most famous headline in its history still stands on 42nd Street, though the paper itself has moved and changed hands multiple times in the decades since. Gerald Ford died in December 2006. He never fully escaped the headline. He said in interviews that it followed him for the rest of his, life. And the city that he refused to save, the city that the headline said he told to drop dead, outlasted him, outlasted the crisis, outlasted the decade that followed, and is still here. But the 60,000 workers who lost their jobs in 1975 are still gone. The firehouses that closed while the Bronx was burning never fully came back. The free tuition at the City University of New York, the 128-year-old promise that a quality education would be available to every New Yorker regardless of wealth, that promise was broken in 1975 and has never been fully restored. Some things that get cut in a crisis come back. Some things do not. And the city that survived has carried the marks of what was cut into everything it became afterward. If you have been watching this channel and wondered why so many of the stories keep circling back to the same era, the same neighborhoods, the same sense of a city that stopped protecting its own people for a decade and then paid an extraordinary price for it. Now you know where it started. Tell us in the comments which part of this story you had never heard before, and which New York story you want us to find next. Everything this channel makes comes from what you ask for. The next story takes us to the most famous bridge in the world on the week it opened, and to the moment that nobody who was there ever forgot. Stay close.